Je sais pas pourquoi.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming so numerous and happy this morning. Today it is my great pleasure and honor to introduce Professor Luc Plonsky, who is a professor of applied linguistics at the Northern Arizona University, where he teaches courses in second language acquisition and research methods. His work in these and other areas has resulted in over 100 articles, a book, chapters, books. Luc is editor of Studies in Second Language Acquisition, managing director of Foreign Language Annals, co-editor of the language series on language acquisition, and co-director of the IRS database. In addition to prior appointments at Georgetown and University College London and the Fulbright Scholar Award at Universidad de Murcia in 2021, Luc has lectured in China, Japan, the Netherlands, Poland, Spain, and Puerto Rico. And you know he has inspired so many of us all over the world.
Just a sec. It's not showing the same thing that I'm seeing. Let's see here. Okay. Preview. We need to talk. Okay. It's coming. Okay, yeah. So thank you so much for the lovely introduction, and thank you so much everybody for being here on this really lovely morning in beautiful Paris. The only thing I might enjoy more than walking around Paris on a Friday morning like this is being here with 100 of my closest friends talking about research methods. So I'm so glad you're all here with me. Thank you. And thanks so much to the organizers for putting this together. It's been so much fun. I love being all together, talking about our research, getting to know each other, learning about what's happening right now in the field in terms of language teaching, language learning. So I have to say, I think about methods, research methods all the time. And these last few days have been inspiring, methodologically speaking, and I'm seeing so many cool things, so many different ideas and angles and ways that people are approaching the questions that we have, taking questions that we have about language teaching, language learning, and applying them in different empirical manners. I feel like electric. I don't know if anybody else shares that feeling, but I also feel, as a methodologist, and the way that I look at the field, that we have some serious problems that we need to tackle and that we need to address if we're going to be a legitimate academic discipline in the eyes of our peers, in the eyes of our administrators, if we're going to contribute back to other disciplines, if we're going to actually find out the things that we want to learn about language teaching and language learning. We need to talk. A couple comments of preface. I want to just for you to consider for a minute as we get into this. First question, I ask, what does it say about us as a field that until recently, okay, and this has changed a little bit, we've not had a strong tradition, Richard, where you at, a strong history of formal expertise in research methodology. We've been carrying out empirical research for decades. and we know that on language teaching, language learning, and related things. But have we had people that identify as methodologists? Have we had a strong tradition of courses, even, semester-long courses? Have we had people that sort of lead methodological movements? No, we haven't really had that so much. I'm not saying there hasn't been people with expertise, with isolated expertise, but it hasn't really been a part of our tradition. So what does that say about us as a field? Relative to other disciplines such as education and psychology, where that tradition has long existed. People identify as methodologists. People get degrees in educational research methods, things like that. What does that say about us? Second, I want to say the efficacy of the mechanisms. There are mechanisms meant to ensure the quality of our discipline, right? We have things like methodological training, graduate training, publication guidelines, peer review, right? But the efficacy of these mechanisms is not well understood, and is when we have some evidence about it, and we do have some research looking at the efficacy of methodological training, methodological literacy, which Sean was talking about just yesterday, the evidence is not great. And so my position here is that study quality, if we're going to continue to develop and advance our discipline, study quality needs to be assessed rather than assumed. Assessed itself as an empirical matter. And then third, I feel like if we don't insist on quality, what is the point? What are we doing here? Are we just playing around? Is this just for fun? Is this just a career? Like, are we just doing jobs just to get paychecks? I don't think so. I really don't think so. I'm not cynical in that way. I really think that we're here because we care about this. We care about understanding better language teaching and learning, our practice, our field. And we care about the legitimacy and the respect of our discipline. You know, when I first proposed my PhD dissertation to my two advisors, there was a woman named Sue Gass and Sean Lowen, if anybody happens to know them. And I said, I want to do a PhD on research methodology. And they're like, well, you can't do that. That's not a thing. That's what they said. They're like, well, and one of them was like, well, what are you going to be when you grow up? And I was like, I'm going to be a methodologist. And this is only I'm getting a little older now. But this was only like 15 years ago. And they were like, no, you can't be a methodologist in our field. And I was like, well, can I try? Can I try? And thankfully, I'm really appreciative of the fact that they let me do it. They let me do what I wanted to do, which was try to become a research methodologist and do my PhD on research methods in the field. Couple disclaimers. This talk is going to be a bit numbery, okay? And I'm not saying quantitative, but it is going to be quantitative. I like this idea of let's move away from quantitative qual distinction and let's talk about things being numbery and feely, okay? So this is going to be a bit numbery. I want to say though that I love the quant stuff. I lean very much quant. Whether you do or you don't, that's totally okay. But I love that stuff, but not just because I'm a quant geek and I am a quant nerd. That's true. But I care about the methods and the stats, not just because I love those things, and I do, but because of the information that they give us, the views that they give us on the things that we actually care about, the substantive issues of language teaching and language learning, assessment, policy, curriculum, materials, whatever it is that you care about. Okay, so it's just a tool that I care about, that we use to get at the things that we actually care about, which is teaching, learning, and peripheral issues. Although this is going to be kind of numbery, many of the arguments that I'm going to make today and the framework that I'm going to propose, I believe pertain to all the field, no matter what kind of research you do, as long as you care about empirical research. Okay, and I think most of us do. And I also want to say that I think the qual-quant distinction is false, it's tired, it's divisive. We don't need this dichotomy, and I would like us to, as a field, move on. And I'll address that a little bit more later. So I've been talking a little bit about quality, but what is it? What is it? It's something that we all care about, I believe we all care about study quality, empirical research quality. But if we went around the room right now, and we're not going to do this, but if we did, I think we would probably all have something different to say about what quality means for us. There are lots of different ways of understanding this notion. One way we might do would turn to the sociology and philosophy of science. So the Mertonian norms of science would say that quality is communism, universalism, disinterestedness, and organized skepticism. I think that these might be useful for starting a conversation with our colleagues in philosophy, with our colleagues in sociology of science, but I think these are too abstract and they're too difficult to operationalize. Like I said before, I think that we need to actually assess study quality. So if we're going to assess it, then we have to also be able to operationalize it, okay? Another angle we might take is, some of you might be familiar with Shadish Cook and Campbell's classic text on causal inference. Okay, and so they proposed a 4-part model of causal inference with talking about different threats to validity, statistical validity, external validity, internal validity, and construct validity. And I'm sure most of you are familiar with those terms. This model, I feel like, is useful in some ways if we're doing research that's interested in causality, like interventionist experimental designs, but not all of us do the kind of research. I feel like this is too post-positivist. This is merely concerned with just causal inference. So I don't think this actually applies. This came out of psychology, when a lot of psych methods can be useful for what we do in language teaching and learning, and what I identify with as an applied linguist and a second language acquisition researcher. But I don't think this applies entirely to our field. So we need something that's a little bit more applicable to our field. I tried to address this in my dissertation and then the studies that came out of my dissertation. I defined quality as adherence, initially quality as adherence to standards of contextually appropriate methodological rigor in research practices, and B, transparent and complete reporting of such practices. Okay, I thought that was pretty good, and I think that's part of it, but I think that's also too narrow. For me, quality has to go beyond simply doing rigorous research and reporting that research transparently. That's not quite enough. So what I want to do is, in this talk, propose a framework for quality that we can use to carry out our own research, to train other researchers, to assess our own research as a field or individually, as journal editors, as journal reviewers, as authors ourselves, researchers, researcher trainers. And this is a 4-part framework. The first is transparency. That's part of the initial definition that I gave, so I want to include that. The second part is methodological rigor, so those 2 parts are from the initial definition. And I think that most of us would probably agree that those belong in the definition. I also want to add to that quality research is not only transparent and methodologically rigorous, but that makes a contribution to society. I think that has to be, and by the way, that's not exclusively non-academic society, that's academic society. Scientists, researchers are part of society. So if you make research that can be of quality that doesn't necessarily contribute outside of the academia, I think it's better when it does. I hope that we all do, and I think that most of us do, but it doesn't have to. So research has to be transparent, has to be methodologically rigorous, has to contribute to society. These are my kids, which sort of in this talk will represent society, sort of outside of the walls of academia, because they don't care at all about academia. They don't care. I come talk about research methods, they're like, I'm done. Like before I even start talking, they're done. And then finally, for research to be of high quality, it has to be ethical. It has to be ethical. And I take a very broad definition of ethics. I'm not talking here about not harming participants. I'm not talking here just about protecting the anonymity of participants. For me, ethics goes far beyond those very, very basic minimal qualifications for ethical research. So how are we doing on quality? I said that I wanted to propose a framework that would be operationalizable, that would be accessible for our field. Spoiler alert, it's not looking good. It's not looking good. And this is hard to face. As much as I care about our field and the people in it, I don't think we're doing a great job so far in meeting these standards of, according to this framework, of study quality. And in fact, to go further, I think we're not okay. There's little evidence of high quality research actually in the field, and there's abundant evidence of low and questionable quality. And I think what this does to us is it introduces, when we're not perceiving it, it's like carbon monoxide. It's like slowly entering the room, and sort of, I know it's dark, but it's getting into us, and it's entering our academic spheres and our world in a way that we're not even perceiving it, and it's sort of killing us as a discipline in some ways. I'm not saying that we're going away, but I think that it's really, really unhealthy for us, little by little. sort of like the fish in the boiling pot of, or the frog in the boiling pot of water. Like almost like we're not noticing it, but it's here. So I'll give evidence of that. I'll also give some evidence, by the way, this is not going to be totally dark, okay, I promise. I'll also give evidence of, and reason to be hopeful. Okay, so in this talk in specific, I have a lot to say about this different framework, but I'm going to focus specifically on the evidence that we have to date in relation to two sub-constructs within this framework of study quality: transparency and methodological rigor. I have other papers that will talk that have talked about and that will continue to talk about the societal contribution and the ethical component or element of the framework. But I also want to point out the fact that these are all really closely connected. We can't have ethical research that isn't also methodologically rigorous. Because to me, to carry out research that isn't methodologically rigorous is unethical, right? Our research can only be ethical to the extent that it actually also contributes to society. Well, we can't do research that contributes to society if it's not methodologically rigorous, right? If there are major threats to the validity of our studies because we have poor instrumentation, poor design, bad sampling practices, inappropriate data analysis, right? Then by consequence, of course it can't contribute to society, right? In the same way that, and that to me is also an ethical breach. That if we do research that's not good, that's not of high quality, that's not methodologically rigorous, research can only contribute to society if we're also transparent. And what I mean by that, taking a broad understanding of transparency, if we don't make our research accessible and available to the public, how can it possibly benefit the public? If we don't do that. Now, there are ways that we can do this now more and more, different open science practices, and I'll talk a little bit about these in a little bit, but there are ways that we can be more transparent with our research as a way, I think, to contribute in a greater fashion to society. But see, these are all closely connected to me. And I view, and I was saying a minute ago, I view methodological rigor as an ethical issue. So we're not actually behaving as ethical researchers when we don't carry out a research according to the highest standards of methodological rigor. Okay, so these are all connected. I'm mostly going to focus on methodological rigor and transparency. So first, transparency. Do I really have to report that? Yeah, you should. Okay, so transparency. Transparency is there's a little bit of an argument for transparency. Okay, in case everybody's like, well, why does transparency matter? Transparency is necessary, of course, for secondary research. A lot of what I do is meta-analytic or synthetic in nature. I do a lot of secondary research, research on research, or meta-research, or meta-science. And those of us who do meta-research, of course, need to rely necessarily on thorough and transparent reporting practices in the primary literature. Right, so Marisa, I don't know where you are, we were talking about meta-analysis the other day. We absolutely need, if we're going to do, for meta-analysis to be thorough and adequate as a way to understand, to get a sort of cumulative understanding of the effect of A on B or the relationship between X and Y, we need to have thorough and transparent reporting in the primary literature. Okay, so we also need transparency in order to assess replicability, reproducibility. Okay, meta-analysts are always complaining about the lack of transparency in primary studies. Transparency also helps us evaluate and is therefore a prerequisite for every other facet of quality, right? We can't contribute, as I said before, we can't contribute to society if the primary literature isn't transparent. We can't assess whether the research is ethical if it's not very transparent. And we also can't assess the methodological rigor if the research isn't reported transparently. Okay, so it's closely associated with the other three dimensions in this framework. As Lourdes Ortega told us 20 years ago, okay? Transparency, on the plus side, we see, as I mentioned before, all these different open science practices making their way into our field right now, which is great. I don't know if you all are seeing that very much around here, but it's very much on my radar, seeing lots of wonderful things. And just for example, this is a website of a scholar at University of Maryland, a junior scholar named Bronson Hui, who indicates on his personal website all of his open science practices. Each of those little icons is indicating whether it's open data, open materials, a study that's pre-registered, things like that. So we're seeing author initiative. So some of this bottom-up, what you might call bottom-up initiative of scholars saying, I'm going to purposely and effortfully be transparent with my audience and with the field. I'm going to make my data available, make my research available. Like sort of the idea that we're kind of all in this together. To me, that's part of what open science is about. We have people that are creating different tools. Like, I don't know if anybody knows Chris Kyle. If anybody does corpus linguistics type stuff here, Chris Kyle has made this huge and wonderful suite of natural language processing tools, all the code, all the tools, fully downloadable. A guy named Atsushi Nishimoto also does a full suite of statistical software, all online, all free. Ant Conk, if anybody else does corpus linguistics research by Lawrence Anthony, free corpus tools, sort of this like sharing of materials. I think this is much more the sort of the direction for us to go. Kazuya Saito has on his website, SLA Speech Tools, all these tools that are freely available for and validated for doing speech analysis. We also see in sort of the more top-down fashion, right? So we have this kind of author initiative, individual researchers saying, I'm going to make the effort to make my research, my data, my materials, all of this available. We also have, and lots of, by the way, our governments, a lot of them are saying, okay, well, if we're going to fund your research, it needs to be publicly available. It needs to be visible, and the tools as well, which is great. So we also have open science, sort of infrastructure, top-down, open access journals, language learning and teaching, studies in second language learning and teaching, the Dutch Journal of Applied Linguistics. The Dutch Association for Applied Linguistics recently said that their flagship journal, the Dutch Journal of Applied Linguistics, they're going to just fund it entirely to make it totally open access, which I think is awesome. We have journals encouraging and requiring open practices. The IRIS database, which has over 3,000 instruments and research materials from published research, 200 data sets, scripts, code, the Open Science Framework. The BAL, the British Association for Applied Linguistics, their 2023 conference theme was open science. There's a research network in ILA, the International Association for Applied Linguistics. And we've had lots of, oh gosh, I'm sorry, I'm not sharing those with you. And we've had a number of different improvements in reporting practices observed in different meta-studies. But we also have problems. We have non-data-rich visuals, and I can talk about that more if anybody wants to talk about that later. Unshared data and non-replicable analyses. So I've done a number of data reanalysis projects where we take the raw data from the published studies based on what they said they did and try to reanalyze it. This is not personal. This is not about trying to point out people's faults. I'm not interested in doing that at all. But just trying to see, are the studies reported thoroughly and transparently enough for us to find to replicate the analyses, replicate the results, and we're generally not. In very few cases are we able to do that. Number of deficiencies in reporting, right? Reliability estimates not being reported, statistical assumptions not being checked and reported. Isabel and Kim found very recently only 3 of 68 studies in their sample in the field of language testing, 4% of studies that should have reported a conflict of interest reported that conflict of interest. We're talking about people who work for testing agencies, for example, for-profit testing agencies, not reporting that they work for those for-profit testing agencies. This would be like pharmaceutical companies doing research on the efficacy of a drug and not reporting that they work for the pharmaceutical company. Right? This is crazy. This is crazy. Only 4% in their sample that should have reported the conflict of interest. Okay. In terms of showing the connection between transparency with ethics and rigor and with society, we've had a number of now surveys of what we call questionable research practices. These are sort of these gray area decisions that many of us make. And I'm not immune to these. But we've seen overall widespread what we might call sins of omission. Simply people not including the things that need to be included. So in Isbell et al. 2002 paper, what we found was many different instances of author suppression of results. This is a withholding of information that is potentially very valuable to the field. So up in the top, the first one there, I know you guys probably can't see it all, but 14% of our sample of 351 applied linguists who all publish in the field said that they had intentionally not reported a particular finding because it runs contrary to the literature. I'm like, if it runs contrary to literature, we need to know about that too. In fact, we might need to know about that more than findings that align with or that agree with previous literature. 11% excluded findings because it goes against their own previous work or their colleagues' previous work. More concerningly, 43% here excluded findings simply because they were not statistically significant. So what does that do to the published record? That necessarily inflates the published record, especially if you think about it at the meta-analytic level. Right, that we're getting this bias introduced by the authors themselves or by the authors ourselves, right? Other people, 48%, the highest percent of all these questions that we asked had admitted to not even attempting to publish a study because of non-significant results. So do we then, what do we do about this? Do we as a field then accept, okay, I guess all of our findings, all of our meta-analytic findings, or all the findings are an overall overestimate of the true effects or relationships that we care about? I suppose that's the case. 44% said that they withheld methodological details from the method sections of their studies simply to avoid criticism from peer review. This is problematic, okay? In another more recent study, Larson et al., this is another study looking at questionable research practices that we've been carrying out the last few years. Similarly, 96% reported admitting to one or more of the questionable research practices. We had a taxonomy for that study of 58 questionable research practices, and I can show anybody who's interested later. But sample of 230 applied linguists and scholars in other humanities, and 96% reported one or more of these questionable research practices. And I'm not saying that these are categorically unethical, okay? I want to be clear about that. Some of these things in certain contexts are appropriate and fitting, but in many cases, these are things that we should not be doing. Okay, so just summing up from the transparency. Transparency is a prerequisite for assessing all the other dimensions of quality, for societal contribution, for ethics, for methodological rigor. We've seen some improvements, but deficiencies remain widespread. And currently, this is part of the problem, we have no comprehensive, field-specific guidelines for transparency, for what we do, right? There's educational guidelines, there are guidelines for psychology, but we don't have this for what I would call broadly the language sciences, called didactics, applied linguistics, second language acquisition, but the language sciences more generally is sort of what I might say we pertain to. Okay, second one, methodological rigor. And this ties closely to what Jean-Paul mentioned just on Wednesday about the language he used was limitations of research methodologies, which are very much present, a very, very important angle on this definition of quality. I'm going to talk about three specific areas: design in terms of sampling, instrumentation and the notion of validity and measurement, and data analysis, the evidence that we have. But there are lots of different angles that we could take. So, first of all, I want to say that, and this is obvious, but I think it has to be said anyway. Methodological choices that we make have direct effects on study outcomes. As Vachahaas and Thompson 20 years ago put it, effect sizes, right, the outcomes of our studies, are not magically independent of the designs that created them. Okay? So I question sometimes, when there's so many choices that we make when we carry out a study, I question sometimes whether we actually know what we think we know. This is an issue of epistemology again, to some extent. But many of the methodological choices we make can and should be viewed also, as I was saying before, through the lens of ethics. So our research, I think, can only be ethical to the extent that it is methodologically appropriate and methodologically rigorous. When we contribute, when we make poor decisions in our designs, even just something as simple as an underpowered or very, very small sampled study that's going to give us what I would call kind of a bouncy estimate, right? When we have small sample studies, those means or those estimates that we come up with are not stable, and we publish them in the literature, they may not be representative of the actual relationships or effects that we care about, okay? And there's an important role, I think, here for methodological synthesis and meta-analysis as tools for understanding the methodological choices in the published literature. Okay, sorry. These are all connected. So one example of this is sampling. So there's two major issues in relation to sampling. First is sample size, of course, matters a lot. Size, larger samples get us greater power, greater precision, greater stability. This is an issue related to internal validity. Okay, so I found, looking across 600 primary studies, that the average sample size, group sample size, was only 19. And it's going to give us a lot of unstable estimates in quantitative research especially. But we also have, the other sort of complementary to that is the diversity of our samples, which leads to generalizability or external validity. And so some of the evidence here can be seen in target samples. And I know that all of us here are interested in language, all of us, or almost all of us here, are interested in the teaching and learning of English as a second language. But we found in this methodological synthesis of learner corpus research that the vast majority, the gray parts of these bars across 3 decades represent studies concerned with English as a target language, and the yellow bars were languages other than English. You know, in all of learner corpus research. And so it's like, do we actually understand about language learning and about second languages in general, or do we understand basically about English as a target language? Okay, and so the people in this room, this doesn't pertain as much, but for those who care about language learning in general, this is a problem. In terms of who we sample, not how many people we sample, also though, Lourdes Ortega said, most of what we know pertains mostly to formal learning by highly literate adolescents and adults in schools and universities, right? Robert de Keyser said, almost every sample has been one of convenience. Well, using a methodological synthesis or a meta-analytic or a secondary or synthetic point of view, we can assess this. And this is exactly what a recent grad out of my PhD program found. She found that the vast majority of the samples of her, she had 113 studies here looking at anxiety and motivation. They're almost all samples of convenience, okay? So the sampling is not a neutral choice. This is a choice that we actually make, and that may actually have, it may contribute or limit our ability to contribute to theory as well as to practice beyond narrow and likely already privileged settings. So if the vast majority, and we found this many, many times, many of us who've looked at sampling practices have found, if 90% of our samples occur in settings like this, and I'm not criticizing anybody here, or my university as well, I collect data there because it's convenient, but do we actually understand language learning or language teaching, or do we understand a population that is not representative of the world's population? People in universities are not typical people. They're not representative necessarily of the average person on planet Earth, which is what we understand. And by sampling so heavily using convenience sampling, we're not able to adequately serve the scientific or the academic community. People who care about, as we all do, diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. Right? We need to sample outside of our convenient university settings. Okay. Second point in relation to methodological rigor, I want to talk just very briefly about instrumentation and validity. Most of what we care about is the constructs, the variables that we care about are both latent, meaning not directly observable, and qualitative. Even though I'm a really quanti kind of guy, stats nerd, okay, admittedly speaking, we need, the things that we care about are actually, think about any construct you care about, anything that matters to you, it's qualitative in nature, even if you do quantitative research. It's also latent, meaning not directly observable. What that means is that we need to build a validity evidence, a validity argument for the instruments that we use to measure those things. Lourdes Ortega said, and Marisa gave some excellent examples of, she mentioned validating the instruments that they're using in their research. It's not an easy task, and I'm sure that she and her team went through many, many rounds of piloting and revising and basing those instruments and those surveys and scales on the constructs that they care about, and then revising and piloting more and more and more to build that validity argument. Okay, this is not a question of you put together some items over the weekend and then you run the study. Lourdes Ortega said, problematic is the tendency to assume rather than build an empirical case for the validity for whatever assessment method is adopted. Carol Chappell, scale validation should be of central importance for the credibility of research results. Sorry, keep missing that. Rod Ellis said, while researchers have always recognized this issue, validity in SLA measurement, they have largely ignored it. Norbert Schmidt said, vocabulary tests are not validated to any great degree. Cohen and Macro, there's perhaps an unwritten agreement that readers will accept measures used in SLA study at face value. Is this true? Do we not have, and again, going back to the question of, do we actually know what we think we know? Because if we don't have valid instruments to measure the things that we care about, do we know what we think we know? I wonder about this, and I wonder what you all think. This is also closely, of course, tied to ethics and transparency and society, right? Because if we don't have good instrumentation, we don't have findings that we can trust, and therefore, to me, that's unethical. We can't contribute to society, that's also unethical. And how do we assess whether we know what we think we know, whether we have valid instruments? Well, that's through transparency. Ekaterina Studina, she found very little evidence of convergent, divergent, construct, criterion-related validity. In that survey of questionable research practices, we found one of our questionable research practices was choosing a design or instrument type that provides comparatively easy or convenient access to data instead of one that has a strong validity argument behind it. And when we gave that question, among many other questions, to our survey participants, that was the second most frequent QRP, or questionable research practice. The second most frequent in the sample, and you can see it here. I know it's not super visible, but the red bar, each of these bars represents the frequency or the prevalence of each of the questionable research practices in our taxonomy. That was the second most frequent one. right? Just using an instrument because it's convenient, because somebody else used it before me, but not because it has a validity argument behind it. Okay? What about a corpus-based approach to estimating validity in second language research? What do I mean by that? What I did was I was curious about this question of to what extent we actually have or presented validity argument or evidence for the validity of our measures. And so I took this corpus that I've collected over the years. It's got 23,000 studies, 150 million words of published second language research, converted these to text files, and I simply searched for different instances or sort of lexical items related to validity, and I found that overall we don't talk about validity like at all, hardly at all. 4 in 100 articles mentioned the words construct validity. Okay. 1 in 1,000 words mentioned these different facets of validity. I know that this isn't relevant or pertinent to everybody's research here, but if you're measuring anything, then these do matter. Okay. And 1 in every 23,000 articles mentions nomenological validity. Okay, so that's we don't really talk about that ever. But even divergent validity, 1 in every 1,000 articles mentions divergent validity. These are different facets of validity of quantitative measures, sort of a psychometric approach. Now, just to be clear, this doesn't mean that we don't. You can present construct validity evidence without mentioning the words construct validity. I know that. Right? But also, just because you mentioned the words construct validity doesn't mean you actually are presenting evidence of construct validity either in the article. Okay, so this is not a perfectly valid measure of the thing I'm talking about. This is sort of a quick and dirty way to figure out how much we're using these terms as a proxy for caring about different facets of validity. That's what I'm saying. Okay, but I think this is a problem. It's a problem that we don't ever talk about, almost ever talk about concurrent validity or even construct validity. Okay. So last one in this area, data handling and analysis. We have many problems here. We have many, as I mentioned before, non-reproducible analyses. We over-rely on a very small range of analytical tools. We engage in a lot of what you might call button-pushing analysis. Sort of, I like to think of it as like, I tell my students, like before we even run the analysis, let's get some data underneath our fingernails. Let's dig into the data. Let's really look at the raw data, get our descriptive, some good visuals, spend a lot of time on the data before we even run any tests. I don't see any tests, okay? We have many problems, additional problems. We have an obsession with statistical significance, always simply trying to achieve p-values below 0.05, which is silly. P-values are unreliable, they're uninformative, they're arbitrary, they're inefficient, which to me is unethical. I think inefficiency is actually another type of unethical behavior. Right, a p-value. The American Statistical Association, which I think knows a couple. I think they know some things about stats. They said, don't believe it because I say it, right? They said a p-value does not provide a good measure of evidence regarding a model or hypothesis. That's the American Statistical Association. We need to move away from statistical significance and p-values. That's a whole other issue. If anyone wants to talk about that, I have very strong feelings. I would be happy to talk to you about it at length, as you can imagine. We have questionable data handling and analysis practices, as we've shown. This sort of goes back to those QRPs, the questionable research practices, right? We developed this taxonomy, as I mentioned, of 58 questionable research practices for quantitative humanities research. We found that QRPs are highly pervasive. Here they are. We won't go through all these right now. But in just the section, one of the sections of QRPs was, the bottom one here is data analysis and interpretation, and we found that these are fairly prevalent. And this is according to authors themselves, ourselves. Okay. And then, maybe more dramatically, one of the other studies we did of questionable research practice, this is the Isabel et al. Study, 2022. We asked also not just about questionable practices, but we also asked about fraud in our very own field. And this is the sample of 351 applied linguists, all had published. We asked, have you ever, like never have I ever, have you ever engaged in data falsification or fabrication? Any guesses on what percentage said they did this? Now, as a point of reference, in other fields, the average, according to a meta-analysis, was around 2%. In our very own field, it was 17%. 17% said that they had changed, fabricated, or falsified data. This is our very own field. And listen, I hesitate to even say this out loud. It's embarrassing for us. I don't think it's good for us. Like if our colleagues from our faculties, from other faculties on campus, if they come to this, if they hear this, what are they going to think of us? They're going to think, oh, 1 in 6 of those language teacher folks are unethical, are fabricating their data. Again, this goes back to the question of like, what are we doing here? Like, what is the point if we don't care about this and care about doing it right? Are we just playing the career game, just publishing to publish? I don't think that that's what we want. Okay, that was the low point, okay? That was the low point. Now we'll finish up here. And I want to say, despite all these problems that we have to talk about these problems, right? Like a family, we have to sort of come, I don't know if anybody else uses this term, this expression, like a come to Jesus moment. But like, despite all these challenges, I'm still consciously optimistic. Please pardon the dad joke, okay? I'm a dad. Heidi Burns referred to over 10 years ago already what she saw as a methodological turn in applied linguistics. So don't just take my word for it. She was a former editor of my Modern Language Journal. And as she pointed out, and I totally agree, methodological issues demand a kind of professional scrutiny that goes directly to the core of what we do and what we know. Okay? Others would call this meta-science, essentially. Meta-science. And that's what I'm doing. I'm trying to do. I'm not going to go through all of this just for the sake of time, but there's so many exciting, inspiring, positive things happening right now in research methods, in applied linguistics, in language teaching and learning. So many books, new book series. Rosa Manchon is the series editor of a new book series published by John Benjamins on research methods in applied linguistics. Methodological syntheses, sometimes in the context of meta-analysis. Studies of statistical literacy, statistical training, statistical development. The Nolan and Warnsby paper, I see that as part of that, looking at statistical literacy and methodological literacy and training. Tons of conferences, workshops, summer schools, boot camps, all on research methods. These are just a few examples over the last couple of years. At AAAL, American Association for Applied Linguistics, a methodological conference in Montpellier, in Warsaw, in Malta, Lancaster, UCL, Penn State. An interest in, a serious interest and expertise in mixed methods. There are at least 3 different clubs at different universities I know of in research methods. I think this is so cool. The one we started at my university, at Northern Arizona University, is called, can anybody guess the name? Coffee and Cronbach. Okay, you know Cronbach, research methodologist. The other one in the middle is Donuts and Distributions. The one right here, and that one's at Michigan State. The one I'm representing here on the far right is at Cologne University in Germany. Reproducibility and the humanities. Okay, so if you guys start one at your university, it has to have a breakfast theme, a hot drink. Okay, get your day started with some coffee and stats, right? We have new methodological guidelines. We have journal issues, methods, strands of different journals. All of those journals up there represented just by abbreviations have different dedicated strands now to research methods. We've had a lot more interest in replication research. Sierra Wigman et al., I'm not sure where she is, presented a replication study just yesterday. I think that's great to see. Right, all these different sort of influence and support from the top down from our journal editors. Progress on research ethics, which I also see as a methodological issue, as I mentioned, open science initiatives, new techniques being introduced. Not that we want to get into sophisticated statistics just for the sake of sophistication. We should not do that, but it's good to see the introduction of new techniques. Right, bootstrapping, mixed effects models, structural equation modeling, Bayesian data analysis, the Delphi method, propensity scores, survival analyses, right? And a reconsideration, or what Heidi Burns would have called professional scrutiny of familiar techniques. All these together, I think, contribute major steps towards quality. Looking forward, I won't go through all these just for the sake of time, but so many things that we can do as individuals. Consider if and how you're contributing to different dimensions of quality. Insist on quality as a co-author, as a reviewer, as an editor, as a researcher trainer. Practice open science. Start a methods club, right? Hot beverages are required. Or cold beverages. I had a little methods club with a friend of mine at Georgetown, and we called it beers and bays, right? And that's okay too. Cold beverages. Start a methods club. Develop in-depth substantive and methodological expertise. When you write up your bio, right, on your website or whatever, think about what are your substantive interests and areas of expertise, language teaching and language research, whatever research you do, but also what are your methodological expertise, What are those areas of methodological expertise that you have, right? Those identify as methodologies. Conduct methodologically oriented research, meta-science. Let's move away from refuting the null. Question and examine methodological conventions. Think and act synthetically. The idea that any single study will provide a conclusive answer to any question worth asking is ridiculous. Future research. There's a special issue coming out soon on different dimensions of equality, right? I would like us to see as a field also evaluating some of these other areas within the framework of study quality. So for example, does society at large even know we exist? Does the average person on the street know what an applied linguist is? Has anybody in the real world ever heard of second language acquisition? No. What does that say about us? That we don't have this visibility, this recognition. Are we actually doing quality research if nobody knows we exist? If you say you're a botanist or a biologist, an evolutionary biologist, the world has some point of reference for what that means. Nobody, I think, knows that we exist, and what does that mean? Are we actually contributing to society in a meaningful world, in a meaningful way? We can study that. We can study that. We're researchers. We can study the extent to which the world knows we exist, the extent to which our research has visibility, has impact in the real world. And I think we should. I also think that we need our own field-specific guidelines. We are not psychology. We are not exclusively education. We are not sociology. We're not anthropology. We are something else. So I think that as part of our sort of legitimacy, we need to develop our own field-specific guidelines. As a resource for journals, as a resource for researcher trainers, for researchers in training, for scholars in other fields. There are people in psychology and anthropology and related disciplines that do language-related research, and they just like make it up as they go. I've reviewed a lot of papers for other journals in other fields, and they're like making up corpus linguistics. And I'm like, whoa, wait a second. Like, we're here, hi. We've been here for a while. Like, there's a whole field that does this. There are methods and tools that exist. You can't just make it up. You can't make up discourse analysis. But there are people that do it in other fields. They're like, oh, I'm just gonna put together some text, and then I'm gonna kind of analyze it kind of the way that makes sense to me. Like psychologists do this sometimes. I'm not criticizing psychologists. But they don't know that linguists have developed tools to do the things that they want to do. That's their fault, but it's also partly our fault for not putting ourselves out there. So we need these guidelines for ourselves, for other researchers that care about language, and there are many that care about language. Will these guidelines be perfect? No, but I think we still have to do it. As Gass et al. Put it 25 years ago, respect for the field can only come through sound scientific progress. I think this is necessary for, you could even say, for the survival of our discipline. Okay. And just to conclude, I thought about lots of the way I want to conclude, but I just want to say in very, very simple terms, I think it's our intellectual yes, but it's also our ethical duty to continue to produce more high quality research. So with that, I will stop. Thank you so much.
It works. Pascal.
Thank you so much, Luke, for this absolutely great talk. This is an issue that is, very important to me, and I think it should be to all of us. May I, though, point to an issue that is raised actually by the very name of what you call second language acquisition, and that we in Europe call more often didactics. We are often talking about foreign language learning, which we sometimes oppose to second language learning. And this is an issue that I very often meet when I read articles, because these articles are under, the title of second language acquisition. And as I go through the article, I try to look who is being studied. You mentioned the sample, like who is in the sample. And sometimes it's absolutely impossible to find. And very often, because the writers are Americans or British or Australian, I find out that, because I study English as a foreign language, I find that, or I can guess that the sample is students learning English in the United States or in Australia or in Great Britain, which is a completely different field from our students. For instance, when I studied teenagers learning English in France, surrounded by another 29 French students who don't need to speak English at all. And so this very name, second language acquisition, is an issue, is, in my mind, a methodological issue. What do you think?
Thank you. Yeah, I totally agree. Context matters a lot. Second versus foreign language environment, for example. I view that in the empirical studies, of course, there's a distinction between, there should be a distinction between a second language setting and a foreign language setting. So studying English in the US is not the same as studying English here, and that matters for the outcomes of the study. The name second language acquisition, to me, is sort of, I use that term as a blanket or umbrella term, but when we do the studies, of course we have to interpret them differently. And when we look at this, I'll also just add, because from the meta-analytic perspective, we almost always look at setting as a moderator of study outcomes. So we'll look at the overall effectiveness of X, some treatment or intervention, but then we'll look at it separately, and I've done this in a number of my studies, and almost everybody who does meta-analysis does, look at effects separately from second language environments and foreign language environments, as we should. So I agree entirely. I haven't really thought about the fact that second language acquisition has that problem built into the name, but I agree with you. Thank you.
Right.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm going to preface this by saying I'm a student, so I'm still learning.
We all are.
So I want to go back to the notion of validity, and I'm going to use an example that you gave us when you were speaking about the different types of validity and the different articles that mention the specific types of validity. And then you went on to explain the limitations of these, of how you came about, how you got these results.
Yeah.
And I think that we often have a tendency to do the same thing that you just did, to explain the limitations, to kind of get around that notion of validity in our field. So what do you think about that?
Well, necessary, and better than not explaining the limitations. If everything that we study or that we care about, if there's error in everything we measure, everything. Nothing is directly observable. Nothing can be measured with perfect validity or reliability. And so the best we can do is to try to produce high validity measures of the things that we care about and then explain the limitations of those measures. So that's what we can do. And I'm not saying that this is a perfect model. The thing I was presenting was problematic in many ways too. I don't have it figured out. When I do studies of language learning, I try to do more rigorous. I'm just sort of, what I was presenting here was sort of like a kind of quick snapshot of what we know, how much we talk about validity. But that doesn't mean that that necessarily represents exactly how much we actually care about validity. So I would say build the validity argument. If you want to do a measure of vocabulary knowledge, build the validity argument for that measure of vocabulary. If you want to build a measure or use an instrument for measuring implicit knowledge, explicit knowledge, automatized knowledge, whatever it is that you care about, develop the validity argument for that particular measure or instrument or scale for measuring that thing. If you want to measure motivation, don't just write out a few questions for motivation, build the validity argument for that measure of motivation. That's what we have to do. That's one area that we can learn a lot from our colleagues in psychology and education who have a longer tradition of what's called psychometrics.
Thank you very much, Professor Plonsky, dear Luke, for this very thought-provoking
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
conference. Thank you very much.
You.